now our gospel reading comes to us from the letter according to the Apostle Luke, chapters 18, verses 9 through 14. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus, God, I thank you that I'm not like the other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, will not even look up to heaven, but was beating down his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down from his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Let us pray. God, our refuge and strength, we welcome you this morning. May the meditations of our hearts be pleasing to you, O God. And may your word transform our hearts, our minds, and our souls. In your name we pray. Amen. The good people need confession. I came across this article online from the Jesuit magazine called America. It was published back in 2002, but surprisingly it speaks of a truth that is so relevant today. Professor Vasek from the Jesuit School of Theology is the person responsible for this article. He opens his writing with some dark humor by stating the following. More than one perplexed priest has asked me, what should I do when people come to confession and say they have nothing to confess? It used to be when people had not been to confession in a few years, they would offer a lengthy list of sins. Or longtime sinners would say, you name it, Father, I have done it. Now, surprisingly often, people who have not received this sacrament in, let's say, 5, 10, or even 20 years, say that they cannot think of anything to confess. Isn't that so interesting? While I truly find such statement fascinating, it also worries me. If we have reached a point in society in which we cannot think of anything to confess, then I think it shows that we as people have become disconnected from goodness, and that it's now more difficult than ever to really notice the ordinary ways in which we have caused harm to one another. As the article continues, Professor Vasek answers the posted question in a rather provocative way. Do good people need confession? Spoiler alert, yes. Yes, because there is no such thing as good people. I am aware that this answer is somewhat crude and a little pessimistic, but Professor Vasek says that good people need confession because at the end of the day, just like the people we label or we claim to be bad people, we all have fallen short of who we are meant to be as God's people. Therefore, in some way or another, whether it's small or huge, we all have sinned against God and against each other. Brothers and sisters in Christ, we all need confession. And confession provides us with an opportunity, the opportunity to reflect on ourselves, our actions, our words, our thoughts, and discover that we have indeed made some mistakes along the way. We are not perfect, and that's okay because we are not meant to be perfect. Most importantly, within this opportunity for self-reflection, we also open up our lives and welcome God's grace into the fullness of who we are. In confession, we recognize that we can only be restored and made whole once again, not by the words we say or the things we do, but through the power of the Holy Spirit working through us and working in us. Nonetheless, confession also provides a very dangerous opportunity. The opportunity to claim ourselves as good, or better than everyone else. This self-proclamation can only occur under the shroud of self-deception. And as Professor Vasek writes, self-deception is a very clever way to avoid guilt. Perhaps it was guilt what the Pharisee was avoiding, hiding, as he was praying at the temple that morning. In this parable from Jesus, as presented in the Gospel according to Luke, we read of a Pharisee and a tax collector. For this parable, Jesus chooses very opposite people. People who would simply not get along, they wouldn't hang out with each other, they wouldn't talk to each other, even if they were the only ones left on earth. I do not have to provide you with an example that is current to our time. I'm sure you already know of a few examples about people who seem very opposite nowadays. Why wouldn't they get along? That's the question. Well, on one hand, you have someone who is very committed to obeying the law of Moses, living a life that reflected the teachings of the Torah in a way that portrayed God's blessings upon his life, unlike everyone else. And on the other hand, you have someone who is committed to the law of the Roman Empire, living a life that upheld the Roman interests above the interests and well-being of other people. And while these two characters seem very, very opposite, I think they both share something in common. They're only concerned about their own lives, their actions, their words, their morals, the way they live life. It's only concerned about what is best for them. Selfishness for these two strangers is their common ground. So when the two of them, from their different backgrounds, from their different locations, come to this common ground, the temple at this point, to pray and worship God, you may expect them to at least say something about, I'm sorry for being so selfish. You hope that these two people will come and say something about how their concern for their well-being is so selfish. It has caused to ignore everyone else. But only one of them does. And it is not the one who would seem most likely to do it. The Pharisee's failure to ask for mercy in his prayer is not necessarily the problem presented in this parable. If we read carefully, we realize that he is actually giving thanks at the beginning, right? He is giving thanks to God for all the blessings that God has given him. He is grateful. He is showing that, you've done all of this for me, so I'm doing this back for you. Perhaps if he had ended his prayer right here at this point, he would have been justified, just like the tax collector. Instead, he decides to turn to his neighbor and unfairly assume that this person, the person that seems so opposite from him, this person that does something very opposite from him, this person seemed to have situated himself beyond God's grace and God's mercy. The problem this parable presents so powerfully is how our human nature is constantly guided by self-deception, and therefore assumes the belief that we know better than God. We know better than our Maker. We want to believe that we have the authority to say who can and who cannot receive mercy. And as a consequence, we undertake the righteous responsibility of dispensing as we see most fitting. Friends, self-deception is the most dangerous form of confession. It takes a lot of skill. It requires that we find the right excuses to convince ourselves that we are something other than who we actually are. To deceive ourselves, first we must realize that which is wrong with us. And once we find such darkness, we begin to find all the possible excuses to not turn on the light. Our vision becomes blurry, It becomes selective about what we want to see and how we want to see it. And when there is something that doesn't really fit with our vision, we just say that is a lie. We tend to blame the other for the failures of our own mistakes. Self-deception is not the same as innocence or ignorance. Self-deception knows the truth. It always knows the truth, but chooses to label it as inconvenient or a lie, perhaps. Philosopher and theologian Søren Kierkegaard expressed that self-deception is a refusal to commit oneself to a belief because of the pain of that commitment. Because of the pain of that commitment. So that makes me wonder, what kind of pain was a Pharisee carrying to the temple that morning? What kind of brokenness was he bringing to God, to the temple? Was his guilt so heavy and so painful that he decided to look at someone else's instead? And it is because of this pain, the pain that he's carrying, the pain to acknowledge all the wrongs that he has done, but chooses to ignore them, that the Pharisee doesn't receive justification. When we turn to our neighbor and begin to cast out judgment as if we were the ultimate judge, we must pause. Take a break. We must pause and ask ourselves, what kind of pain, what kind of guilt am I trying to avoid? And do I have the courage to let God's grace shine a light on this pain, on this guilt that I'm carrying? That is why the tax collector was justified. His prayer of confession seems rather simple, right? God, be merciful to me, for I am a sinner. Yet, within this simple prayer, he expresses very complex thoughts. Within this prayer, the tax collector gathers the courage to see the pain that he has caused to others and also to himself. He acknowledges that it is only God who can offer him grace and forgiveness and restoration. As a tax collector, it is very likely that he witnessed many injustices and did not do anything about them. It is very likely that he took money from poor families that was meant to buy food for that day. It is very likely that he sent innocent people to jail for not paying ridiculous taxes. It is very likely that he had caused so much pain to others by following the hostile rules of the land. That is quite a lot of guilt to bring to the temple. That is a heavy burden to carry. And most likely, at that point, that morning, when the tax collector wanted to go to the temple, he could not carry this burden anymore. He could not deal with this pain, with this guilt anymore. So the only thing that he knows is that he will go to the temple. He will go to the place where he can encounter God and God's grace. Unexpectedly, in his prayer, the tax collector does not mention the fact that he will, in fact, stop sinning. Isn't that also so interesting? He does not make the promise that I will not do it again, Lord. Never again. His mouth does not utter any claims for the future. His prayer only focuses on the here and now as informed by his past. It is in his prayer that he acknowledges this pain that he has caused. And because he sees that pain, the rawness of that pain, that he will not cause that pain anymore. He will stop creating pain in the world. So if we have the courage to see the pain that sometimes we have caused to each other, the guilt that sometimes we're carrying that is so heavy, if we see how we have failed to follow God's commandments and God's ultimate commandment of loving each other, and being kind to each other, and welcoming each other, when we see the pain that we have caused, that will keep us from causing that pain ever again. But that burden is heavy. All of that pain, all of that guilt, all of that history behind our backs, all of that is heavy. So what can we do? We come to the temple. We come to the place where God is meeting us this morning. We come and say a prayer. We come and let go of this heavy burden by saying, God, be merciful to me, for I am a sinner. Friends, why do we need confession? Because we need God's grace in our lives. Because in confession we welcome God's grace, God's transformative power in our lives. Because only then we let God's light shine on us. Only then we can share this light with one another. Amen.